Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
At our Christmas dinner, when Uncle Rick leaned back in his chair with that lazy little grin he wears when he's sure he's landed the line that will get everyone nodding along with him, and he announced that Tyler had just bought a brand new car before turning to me with a sugar-coated jab about when I would finally get ahead. I felt the familiar rush of heat crawl up my neck, and I still chose to do the thing I have taught myself to do over years of these family performances, which is to breathe. To look at him like I heard him and wasn't hurt by him, and to answer in a voice that sounded kind rather than cornered. I already have. I just didn't think you cared enough to notice, and the sound in the room dropped like a switch had been flipped. Because the smirk stalled on his face and the clinking and side conversations paused, and for the first time in a long time I saw him wonder if there was something he didn't know. What I did not say, because I do not owe him an inventory of my life, was that I have gotten very good at letting people underestimate me until doing so becomes inconvenient for them. And that I have spent years listening to versions of the same joke about my choices, my timing, my pace, as if life were a scoreboard in his garage where you hang old trophies and point at them during parties, and that it has cost me energy to decide, again and again, not to fight him in the way he prefers, which is messy and loud and ends in someone being called sensitive while he plays innocent and pours another drink. I could feel the table waiting for me to crack, because that is the role they've gotten used to, the one where I laugh along and pretend it was harmless, and I let that expectation sit there for a beat and then gave the smallest shrug and turned my attention to Tyler, who was vibrating with the kind of pride that smells like new plastic, and I told him I was happy for him and asked, very casually, if he had gone with the lease the dealer was pushing before year-end or if he decided to buy outright, and the way he glanced at Uncle Rick told me everything I needed to know before he said anything at all, because that look was not a man making his own decision, that was a man asking his cheerleader for a cue. Tyler laughed, the way people laugh when they want you to believe the topic is light and celebratory, and he said something about how only a fool buys when the smart move is to take the promotional lease and keep your cash liquid. And he said it with the confidence of a person who wants you to hear the word liquid and think of savvy rather than obligations. So I nodded like I was learning, and I asked how many miles they gave him annually and whether the insurance hit surprised him. Since the dealers love to gloss over that part when they are selling you the monthly payment instead of the overall cost, and it was Aunt Donna who slipped first, bragging that his miles were more than enough because work is close and he mostly drives on weekends. Which made my mother's eyebrows climb because even she knows Tyler spends half his life crisscrossing the county for his job and that the miles will be eaten long before the first year is out. I did not press, I did not gloat, I did not pull out anything that would make me look like I came to start a fight. I just kept asking the kind of questions adults ask when they care about the details. Like whether the payments still fit after the insurance and the add-ons actually posted, and how he felt about parking a car like that on the street given how often people end up paying for cosmetic fixes they never planned on. And Tyler answered with the bravado of a man reading the brochure out loud, and yet every answer he gave painted him deeper into a corner where the shiny thing he was using as a status baton looked more like a bill wearing a bow. Uncle Rick tried to course-correct with one of his chuckles that says he's in on the joke and above it at the same time, tossing out a line about how some of us are car people and some of us are bus people. And I let that land because I wanted him to believe he still had the room, and then I took a sip of water and said I was glad Tyler got a deal that worked for him, and that I hoped the miles cap didn't mess with his commute. And that if it did I knew a guy who handles transfers cleanly, without eating the whole penalty, and there it was, a tiny crack in Tyler's smile that was not for me but for himself, the sudden realization that he might be celebrating a trap with balloons on it. If you think that was petty, you would be right to say I could have left it alone and let them have their night, but there is a difference between pettiness and boundaries. And I have learned that sometimes the cleanest way to protect yourself from people who treat you like a punchline is to let their own logic speak out loud in front of them, because when a person needs you to look small so they can feel big, the most effective response is not to shout, it is to remove the stage they are standing on and watch them wobble while they pretend nothing has changed. The tiny piece of revenge, if you want to call it that, was not that I undercut the car story, it was that I refused to play the old part. And in that refusal, I made the whole table look at the gap between what they believe counts as getting ahead and what actually keeps a person steady. And I saw my father glance at me like he'd just remembered I was not a kid at this table anymore, which mattered to me more than I expected, and I tucked that feeling away because I knew I would need it later. I could have stopped there and let the silence be the lesson, and for years that is exactly what I did, but I did not come to this dinner unprepared, and I did not throw that line at Uncle Rick without a plan for the echo that would follow. So while the conversation limped into safer territory and someone passed the desserts, I reached down beside my chair and brushed the edge of a plain folder I had slipped into my bag when I left the house, a folder that would not look interesting to anyone at this table until it was opened, a folder that held a kind of answer he would not be able to laugh off, and I knew exactly when I would place it on the table and exactly what I would say when I did. Which is why when Uncle Rick tried to reignite the comparison game by asking me what I drove these days, I smiled again and told him I would show him in a minute, because tonight was not about the car, and if he thought it was, he was going to find out how wrong he was. If I am honest about how we got to that Christmas table and that line that he thought would land like a joke and instead sat there like a bad smell, I have to admit that I trained them to treat me this way by letting the small cuts slide for years. Because it felt easier to nod along during birthdays and barbecues and pretend the digs about my career, my car, my apartment, even my groceries were family humor, when in reality they were little tests of how much disrespect I was willing to swallow. To keep everyone comfortable, and once you pass that kind of test a few times you become this safe target who will laugh on cue and carry the awkwardness home with you like leftovers you never wanted. It started when I took a job that did not fit their template, because while Uncle Rick worships anything that comes with a title you can brag about loudly and a lease you cannot really afford, I chose work that paid less on paper and more in the ways that actually matter to a person who wants control of her time, and for years that choice gave him an open lane to turn me into the cautionary example, the girl with opinions who must be broke, the one who must be stuck, the one who will eventually come back to the track he understands, with a look on her face that says he was right all along. And every time I walked into a holiday with that expectation in the air, I would promise myself to ignore it and focus on my parents and the cousins I actually like. And then an hour in, he would circle back to the same set of topics, because he cannot survive a gathering if he is not directing the camera to himself. I learned to keep my mouth shut during those lectures where he posed as a life coach and talked about hustle like it was a religion and debt like it was a personality trait. And the only time I pushed back was the night he suggested my grandmother ought to tap her house for a line of credit to help Tyler get a real start, which in his language meant co-signing the lifestyle he wanted his son to show off. Because in that moment I felt something shift inside me that was not anger exactly, but a kind of cold clarity that said I was done letting his confidence pass as wisdom. So I told him I did not think it was smart to put an old woman's home at risk so a grown man could pretend to be ahead, and he rolled his eyes and called me dramatic. And I let him, but I did not let it go. A week later I drove my mother to meet with an attorney she trusted from work, a calm woman who explained things without fluff and did not flinch when I said our family had a habit of making big decisions at dinner and then regretting them by spring. And we set up the kind of documents that make sure no one can bully their way into a house or talk a confused elder into signing a pile of forms she does not understand, and we moved the property into a living trust with my mother as the successor trustee, and we drew clean lines about health decisions and money decisions, and we gave my grandmother the dignity of knowing she was not a pawn in someone else's financial theater. And when Uncle Rick tried a month later to revisit the equity idea in that faux-friendly tone he uses when he wants a favor that benefits him, my mother smiled and said the house was already handled and that we would not be discussing it further. And I watched his mouth open and then close in the way it does when he realizes there is nothing to grab onto. That was the first real revenge, if that is the word you want to use for protecting the person who actually raised us from a scheme that should never have been floated in the first place. And while it did not come with fireworks or raised voices, it changed the climate. Because he felt the shift and started taking smaller shots at me whenever he could, from the brand of my shoes to the price of my rent to the number of dates I went on. Because once you block a man like that from the big lever, He tries to pull any lever left within reach, and for a while I let him. Not because I was weak, but because I was busy building something that did not need his approval and would not thrive under his attention. I did not advertise the choices I made in the meantime, because I learned early that some wins grow best in quiet, so when I paid off the last of the lingering debt from years ago, I celebrated with a cheap dinner and a long walk instead of telling the table and inviting a new round of commentary. When I signed my first client under my own name instead of someone else's, I took the contract to my bank and asked for the boring advice about taxes and savings that makes a future solid rather than noisy. When the bank manager raised an eyebrow at how diligently I had been stacking cash, I let her give me the dullest compliment anyone can offer, which is that I was boring in all the right ways. And I put that phrase in my pocket because boring in the right ways is how you win long games against people who think flash is proof. So when I walked into Christmas with that plain folder in my bag, it was not a stunt, and it was not a surprise I had cooked up in the car. It was a line drawn after years of letting other people define what counted as progress in a family obsessed with public scoreboards, and if I sounded calm when I told him I had already gotten ahead, it was because I knew I did not have to raise my voice to be heard. I just had to stop letting him narrate my life to an audience that was too polite to change the channel. I also knew something else he did not know, which is that people who live for the gotcha moment always leave paper behind, and they almost never think you kept yours. So when he chuckled a few weeks before Christmas and told my mother that he had helped Tyler get a better rate by putting his own name on a small piece of the lease, as if co-signing on a car that was too expensive for one household somehow made him a hero rather than a gambler, I took note, and I asked exactly the right questions in exactly the right places, and by the time dessert was served tonight, I had confirmation of the thing I suspected, which is that his signature sits in a place he would prefer it did not. And while I am not cruel enough to blow up a holiday over a plate of pie, I am absolutely willing to use the truth to reset the balance of power in a family that has needed a reset for a very long time. So yes, I let the car story wobble under its own weight at the table, because that was the small move that keeps the room honest. But the real move started months ago when I took my grandmother out of his financial reach and made sure that our family's future was not decided by whoever spoke the loudest over coffee, and the next move is sitting in that folder by my feet. And the only decision I have left to make is whether I put it down in front of him now or wait for the moment when he feels safe enough to try one more jab, because if he does, I will open it, I will slide out exactly the page that belongs to him, and I will ask one question out loud in front of everyone that he cannot deflect with a smirk. By the time Christmas rolled around and we were all gathered again in that familiar setting where the air always feels thick with old roles and unspoken competitions, I already knew I was not walking into another night of being the family punchline. Because in the months leading up to that dinner, I had done what people like Uncle Rick never imagine someone like me will do, which is to quietly build, quietly prepare, and quietly collect every piece of leverage I might need so that when the moment came, I could let the truth speak for itself without needing to raise my voice or descend into the same shallow game he thrives on. The irony of it all is that for years I was the one told I was too private or too quiet about my life, as if modesty was some flaw I needed to correct, but what they never understood is that keeping things private was not insecurity or shame. It was strategy, because when you tell a family like mine your every move, you invite endless judgment, unsolicited advice, and the kind of gossip that grows legs and wanders into corners you never intended, so I stopped giving them anything to chew on, and instead focused my energy on making choices that would eventually put me in a position where their approval, or lack of it, simply wouldn't matter. Over the last 5 years, while Tyler was bouncing between jobs that looked good on LinkedIn but left him broke and leaning on his parents, I was signing contracts with clients who didn't care how my holiday table treated me, clients who paid on time, who valued consistency, and who gave me the kind of steady base that meant I could pay off every cent of debt and start stacking actual assets, not just Instagram-worthy purchases, and when they were laughing about me driving an older car that didn't scream status, I was sitting with my banker going over boring spreadsheets about savings, investments, and the first property I bought outright because I refused to play the debt as decoration game that they seemed to worship. The folder I carried into Christmas wasn't heavy because of paper, it was heavy because of meaning. Inside were copies of the closing documents from the duplex I had bought 3 months earlier. A property that not only pays for itself, but also covers half the mortgage on the home I already own, which means while they were busy smirking about a leased car and what it supposedly signified, I was walking into that room as someone who is financially free in ways they can't even imagine, someone who doesn't have to smile through conversations about layoffs, gas prices, or balloon payments, because I built something that insulates me from exactly those pressures, and I did it without ever asking anyone at that table for help. I didn't intend to shove the folder in anyone's face the moment I sat down, because that is not who I am and I do not need their applause, but I carried it for one reason. I knew, without a doubt, that Uncle Rick would try to get his laugh again. That he would toss out another line about me falling behind, that he would position Tyler as the golden child and me as the slow one, and in that moment, I wanted to have a clean, undeniable way of breaking the cycle, not by arguing, not by shouting, but by calmly setting down proof that his scoreboard doesn't even apply to me anymore. What people like him never understand is that success doesn't have to announce itself every 5 minutes. Real success can sit quietly in the background, waiting until the exact right time arrives to make itself known, and when it does, it doesn't need a parade or a performance, it only needs to be undeniable, and that's what that folder represented. It wasn't about gloating or humiliating anyone, it was about reclaiming my dignity after years of being positioned as the example of what not to be. And about shifting the narrative in a way that meant I would never again have to sit through those same tired jabs without a response. But I'll admit something here. Part of me was almost eager for him to take the bait that night. Because there's a special satisfaction in letting someone dig their own hole before you quietly hand them the shovel they used and let the whole room see that they were never standing on firm ground to begin with. So while I laughed politely at the surface-level conversations and passed plates around the table, I was watching him, waiting for the spark of arrogance that always comes out when he thinks the family is relaxed enough for him to slip a dagger between my ribs and dress it up as humor. And he did not disappoint, because after dessert plates were cleared and wine glasses were refilled, he leaned in just enough to make it clear the next line was meant for me and not the group, and he asked if I was still renting that little place, or if I had finally gotten serious and bought something, and before I could answer, Tyler jumped in with a laugh about how some people just weren't cut out for ownership, how it's not for everyone, and the sound of his parents laughing along was all. I needed to decide that the moment had arrived. I didn't pounce, though. That would have been too obvious, too reactive, too much like what they wanted me to be. Instead, I smiled, let them think they'd gotten the laugh, and said, as casually as I could manage, that I'd show them in a second, because the truth is always more effective when it unfolds slowly. When it gives people just enough time to believe they've won before it calmly takes the win away from them. As I reached down and brushed the edge of that folder again, I felt an odd sense of calm, almost like relief, because for the first time in my adult life I knew I wasn't about to defend myself. I was about to present the reality they had ignored for years. And there is nothing quite as satisfying as knowing that no matter how they spin it, no matter what words they try to throw on top of it, they can't change the fact that you are standing on solid ground while they're balancing on credit and bravado. And as my hand rested on that folder, I decided I wasn't going to drop it just yet, not in that moment, because revenge, if that's what you want to call it, isn't just about the hit, it's about the timing, and if you strike too early, you give them room to recover, but if you wait until the silence has stretched, until their confidence has peaked, until the whole table is watching to see if you'll swallow the insult again, then when you finally place it down, it will land with the kind of weight no one can ignore, and I knew exactly how I was going to make that happen. The moment I told him I would show him in a minute rather than feed his need for a quick win, I could feel the entire table hover in that uncomfortable space where people decide whether this is going to be another one of those nights where Rick performs and everyone else pretends not to notice, or whether something different is happening. And because I have finally accepted that nothing changes until you change the choreography, I kept my voice steady and my face calm, and I asked Tyler, not harshly and not sweetly, whether the dealer had pushed him into the extended warranty that sounds like protection, but mostly reads like a monthly drip, and whether he took gap coverage through the finance office or through his own insurer, and whether he had looked at the wear and tear clause they bury near the end. And I watched him do the thing he always does when he is committed to a choice for the feeling rather than the math, which is to act like the details are beneath him while his eyes flicker toward the person who gave him the script, and the person who gave him the script, of course, was sitting across from me enjoying the attention like it belonged to him. Aunt Donna tried to smooth it out with that soothing tone she uses in public, saying that everything was perfectly affordable and that with the lease promotion it was practically free, and my mother, who is not a dramatic person, did a tiny double take at the phrase practically free because she has lived long enough to know that nothing labeled monthly is free, and I let the moment breathe for a beat before I said I hoped the miles cap worked for Tyler's commute because when those caps are blown, the charges arrive like a collection of little punches you cannot dodge, and then I did something that was small but effective, which was to lift my glass and offer a toast that was deliberately neutral in the words and pointed in the meaning. Saying here is to new cars and to old habits we are finally outgrowing, and here is to choices that actually make our lives easier 6 months from now rather than louder tonight, and I watched the cousins on my side of the table smile into their glasses. Because they heard me even if they pretended they didn't. Rick could not leave it alone, because men like him treat any calm refusal to play along as a threat, so he leaned back and started into that familiar monologue about how some people just do not have the stomach for ownership and responsibility, how some people are content to stay small, how risk is the price of greatness, and I let him wind himself up because I wanted him to believe he was gathering steam, and when he finally paused for breath I told him I was not anti-risk, I was anti-stupid. And that there is a difference between buying yourself a job you cannot quit and building yourself a life you are not afraid to live, and I said it without venom because the point was not to win the argument. The point was to change the temperature in the room from smug to uncertain. He smirked the way he always does when he thinks he has a clean counterpunch, and he tossed out a line about how renting is nothing but paying someone else's mortgage, a sentence he treats like gospel because it sounds tough and simple. And I said I agreed with part of that sometimes you are paying for other people's decisions, and sometimes you are letting other people pay for yours, and then I let that hang without explanation because the only thing more unsettling than a truth you do not want to hear is a truth you do not yet understand, and while that sat there I reached down and slid the plain folder from my bag onto the table, not opening it, not touching a single page, just letting the presence of it change the posture of the people who know deep down that paper is where talk goes to die. Tyler tried to joke that I had brought homework to Christmas, and one of the younger cousins laughed because they laugh at anything that sounds like it might defuse the moment, and I smiled and said it was not homework, it was just receipts. The kind you keep when you have learned that memory is convenient for people who like to rewrite it later. And then I turned to Aunt Donna, because she is the one at that end of the table who still notices the difference between a gesture that is kind and a gesture that is strategic, and I told her that before we went any further, I wanted to thank her for the way she has always shown up for my grandmother with rides and meals, and that I knew those hours never show up in the stories people tell about the holidays. And I meant it, and I could see that she knew I meant it even as she worried about what might be coming next. Rick, irritated that the attention wasn't adoring him, reached for the lane he trusts most, which is humiliation dressed as wisdom, and he asked me, in front of everyone and with a smile that said he was certain of the chorus he would get, whether I had any advice for Tyler about how to get ahead, since I felt so strongly about the fine print, and for a second I almost answered the way I always used to, with a shrug and a joke to keep the peace, and then I chose something cleaner, which was to look him in the eye and say that getting ahead is not a product or a pose. It is an agreement you make with yourself to stop handing your future to people who sell you monthly payments with a bow on top. And that when you finally make that agreement you stop being impressed by noise and start being obsessed with receipts. He laughed, but it was thinner now, and to anyone else it might have sounded like a man enjoying a spar, yet I know his tells, and I could see him watching the folder like he recognized the outline of the thing he did not want to see, which is that his authority on the subject is performative and fragile, and because I am not interested in dragging anyone. I did not open the property documents or the client contract or the letter that proves the last of my old debt is gone. I simply tapped the folder with one finger and said that if we were going to use the word ownership tonight, we should also use the word liability, and that it is funny how often those two travel together in places people do not expect. And then I asked Tyler, gently, whether he had read the section that explains what happens to the cosigner if the car is returned or if payments are missed, because the dealership loves to skip that page when they sense confidence in the room. The room went very quiet. Not because anyone thought I was trying to embarrass him, but because they could hear in my voice that I was done performing the role they had written for me, and because they know in their bones that when paper meets bravado, paper wins. And I watched Tyler glance at his father again, and I watched his father pretend not to notice, and then I rested my palm on the folder and said that if we are going to measure getting ahead at this table, we should measure it honestly. Which includes leases, liens, and who is actually on the hook when the celebration is over. And right there, with the plates still on the table and the laughter stuck in people's throats, I decided I would ask only one question next, the one that would make the truth unavoidable, and I turned to Rick and asked very calmly whether he preferred I read the section out loud or whether he wanted to tell the table himself exactly where his name appears. When I asked him if he wanted me to read the section out loud or preferred to explain it himself, and the room went so quiet that you could hear someone set a fork down 3 chairs away, I knew he would try to laugh it off first and then pivot to indignation. Because that is the rhythm he trusts when the ground under him starts to tilt, so I did not give him space for either and instead opened the folder with a calm I had earned over years of swallowing smaller storms, and I slid the page toward him with the clause highlighted that spells out, in the plainest language, that a cosigner is not a mascot or a consultant, but a legal adult tied to every consequence that follows missed payments, early returns, or excess miles. And while I said nothing dramatic, I did say that the dealership is very generous with balloons and very stingy with the part where they tell you how fast an almost free monthly amount turns into a handful of penalties once the honeymoon ends, and that if he wanted to keep treating leased plastic like a crown, he should at least be honest about who carries the weight when it slips. He started to say that I was making a scene, and I said that a scene is what happens when people shout about cars to feel powerful, whereas what we were doing now was simply correcting a record, and I turned not to him but to Tyler and asked him, as gently as I could manage in a moment that deserved gentleness, even if the behavior leading to it did not, whether he had seen this page before he signed, because if he had not, he deserved to know who would be called first if life went sideways, and I watched him look at his father, then at the paper, and then at me, and it was the first time all night I saw his confidence shrink into something honest, which is a scary place, but also the only place grown decisions get made. I did not stack humiliation on top of that honesty, because I am not interested in breaking people just to win a night, so I took a breath and laid the second set of pages on the table. The ones that had nothing to do with his car and everything to do with my life, and I said that while we have spent years measuring getting ahead by volume and shine, I have been measuring it in a different way. And that what was in front of them were the boring facts no one ever asks me about because they are used to treating my choices like a cautionary tale, namely that my old debts are gone, my home is owned, and the duplex I closed on in the fall covers its own costs, and then some, which means I do not need a parade for driving something quiet. Because I have built the kind of base that lets me sleep, and I have done it without asking anyone here for a penny or an apology. Rick tried to pivot to the old joke about renters paying someone else's mortgage, and I did not bother to explain the math of tenants covering mine, because the point was not to lecture, it was to remove the stage. So I tapped the last envelope and said this was the piece he cared about even if he did not know it yet. A single-page release form and an email from the dealer's transfer department confirming that they will move the lease fully into Tyler's name with a small fee and a verification that he can handle the payments solo, and that I had already arranged the introduction with a broker who specializes in cleaning up deals that were signed in excitement and regretted in January, and that if Tyler wanted that help it was his to take without strings. He looked at me like I had just reached into his pocket, and I said no, this is the opposite. this is me taking my hands off your pocket and handing your grown son his own wallet, and that the only condition I had, if you wanted to call it that, was not money and not thanks. It was a public boundary we could all live with, which is that our grandmother's house stays out of your mouth forever when the topic is leverage or quick cash, that holidays stop being a sports show where you need someone to lose so you can feel like you won, and that if you cannot manage that, the attorney who helped us set the trust will be happy to send you a letter spelling out the words elder protection in a tone you will not enjoy. And the room let out a long breath, because everyone heard the promise and the warning and understood that both were real. Aunt Donna said she thought transferring the lease sounded like a good idea and asked what it would take, and I told her it would take nothing but signatures, an inspection, and a little humility, and that if Tyler wanted out altogether instead, the broker could place the lease with someone who actually needed that car and was clear on what it cost, and that there was no shame in stepping away from a purchase that turned out to be about noise rather than need, and Tyler surprised me by nodding and saying he would rather own his mistakes than pretend they were victories, which told me there is a version of him that might grow just fine if we stop feeding the performance around him. Rick muttered something about pride, and I said pride is useful when it keeps you standing and dangerous when it keeps you pretending, and then I did the thing I came to do, which was to finish this without triumphal speeches and without giving him a new grievance to ride for the next decade. So I slid the pen across the table and said we could sign the release forms after coffee and that the broker would call on Monday, and that I would email the attorney tonight to document, once and for all, that no one is to approach our grandmother about tapping the house for anything that even smells like a toy, and yes, I use the word toy because sometimes you have to name the thing accurately or it never stops arguing with you about what it is. He asked why I had gone to all this trouble and whether I was trying to show him up, and I said that I went to the trouble because I am done letting a grown man turn family gatherings into a class. Because I am done letting the younger cousins learn that value is volume and that success is a monthly payment you can barely carry. Because I am done being told that the way I prioritize safety and freedom is small or timid when it is neither. And because the truth is I already got ahead and I did not think you cared enough to see it, and tonight I decided I would not hand you the power to pretend you didn't. There was one last page in the folder, and I kept it for the end, because it mattered to me more than the others, and because I wanted the quiet to hold when I said it. A receipt showing that the property taxes on our grandmother's home are already paid for the next 2 years out of the trust, which means no one can wander in with a scary story about bills and use it as leverage. And when I placed it on the table, Aunt Donna put her hand to her mouth and then reached across to squeeze mine, and my mother exhaled in that way she does when she lets go of something she has been holding for months, and for the first time in a long time I felt the room shift from performance into something like relief. We signed the transfer forms after the dishes were cleared, and Tyler asked me for the broker's number and thanked me in a voice that sounded like a person choosing to be an adult, and Rick, who never apologizes directly because he thinks silence is the same as grace, said that maybe he had gotten carried away and that maybe he should worry less about what everyone drives. And I took that as the closest thing to accountability I was going to get tonight and decided I could live with it because my point had never been to break him, only to stop letting him steer. I did not make a speech and I did not demand a toast. I just closed the folder and put it back in my bag and stood up to help with the plates, and as I walked to the sink I could hear the room picking up the thread of safer conversations. The kind that do not require anyone to posture, and when my father caught my eye he gave me a small nod that said he had seen the whole thing and that it had landed, and that was enough, because the win I wanted was never applause, it was peace, and I had finally bought it the only way people like us ever can, with receipts and boundaries and the decision to stop playing a game that was never designed for us to win, and as I sat back down and took a sip of coffee, I realized I could answer his original jab with the simplest truth possible, which is that I already got ahead. I just stopped needing anyone at this table to confirm it.